Welcome to HFY Beyond Terra, where humanity doesn't just survive, it becomes the galaxy's biggest surprise. Subscribe, and let's go beyond Terra.
The storm on Vesper's Reach didn't howl the way wind did on Earth. It sang, a long, hollow note that ran across the ice flats and through the broken bones of abandoned mining rigs, turning every metal rib into an instrument. It made the dark feel deeper and the cold feel personal, like the moon itself resented anything warm enough to bleed. Jonah Ray's kept his head down and his scarf up, visor tinted against the needle drift. The snow here wasn't soft. It was powdered glass and frozen grit, kicked into the air by gusts that could sand a hull seam down to bare alloy. His boots crunched over a ridge where the ice had cracked and Ray frozen into jagged plates. His pack tugged at his shoulders, tools, patch foam, a ration brick, a spool of line. Not much, but enough to make you worth robbing out here. The scanner on his wrist flickered in and out. The storm did that too. 8 signals, smeared them into static. But Jonah didn't need it to find people. Not anymore. You learn to read Vesper's Reach by its mistakes, a smear of darker ice where someone had spilled heat, a crooked line of footprints that tried to look like it wasn't panicking, a trail of torn cloth snagged on a bolt like a little surrender flag. He found the first body half buried behind a wrecked cargo sled. It wasn't human. The figure was long-limbed, the joints wrong in a way Jonah's eyes still didn't like, even after years. The skin visible beneath a ripped sleeve was a muted blue-gray mottled with frost. The face, what he could see of it, had the same careful structure as a dancer's mask. High cheek ridges, narrow mouth, eyes too large for the skull. A Keshari. Refugees most likely. Jonah swore under his breath, pulled his glove off and pressed 2 fingers to the throat ridge. Nothing. He didn't have time for prayers. The dead weren't the priority in a storm that could kill the living in minutes. He stood, turned slowly, and followed the wind. That's when he heard it, something between a cough and a sob, swallowed quickly as if the sound itself might attract predators. Jonah angled toward it, moving low. The ice flats were open and murderous, but there were still places to hide. The skeletal frame of an old processing plant, a tangle of piping that rose like frozen vines. He slipped beneath a bent panel and found them. 3 figures huddled together beneath a makeshift tarp, thin polymer stretched over scavenged rods, weighted down with chunks of ice. The tarp snapped in the wind like a flag on a battlefield. 2 adults, one smaller. The smaller one shook so hard Jonah worried bones might crack. The adults, one male, one female, if Jonah was reading their body language right, had that stunned look people got when they'd burned through fear and arrived at the quiet certainty of dying. The female lifted her head as Jonah approached. Her eyes caught his visor reflection and she flinched like he'd drawn a weapon. Then she did something Jonah had seen in a dozen ports and back alleys across the fringe. She pushed the smaller figure forward and bowed. Jonah froze. Even through the storm, even through the ripping wind, Jonah heard the woman's voice. It wasn't translated. His comm didn't have the bandwidth for that in this weather, but the meaning didn't need software. Her hands moved in a practiced gesture. She pointed at Jonah's pack, then at the small figure, then at the ripped blanket they were sharing, a strip of fabric so thin it was more symbol than shelter. She pressed her palms together and held them out. An offer, a bargain. The smaller one, young, teenage by Jonah's estimate, stared at the ice with a blank expression. She didn't struggle. That was the worst part. It meant she'd already accepted this was her job, to be traded. Jonah's stomach went hard and cold in a way the weather couldn't touch. "No," he said, loud enough to cut through the wind. He pulled his visor up so they could see his face. Human skin, dark stubble, tired eyes. "No, absolutely not." The mother's eyes widened. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the tone. Her shoulders tensed. She grabbed the girl's arm, pulling her back as if Jonah might strike. Jonah lifted both hands, open palms, slow movements. He pointed at the blanket, then at them, then at himself. He unhooked his pack with exaggerated care, set it down, and opened it just enough to show what he had. Patch foam, a heat coil, a small folded thermal sheet, his emergency one. He pulled the sheet out and held it up. Thin, silvered fabric that could trap warmth like a promise. The mother's breath caught. The young one's eyes tracked the sheet like it was food. Jonah laid it over their shoulders gently, moving as if he was placing a crown. The smaller girl jolted at his touch, then stilled when the warmth wrapped around her. Then Jonah pointed away toward the horizon where the storm hid everything. "Come," he said, "not here." The male Keshari made a rasping sound and tried to stand. He collapsed immediately, limbs folding like broken hinges. Jonah swore again. He took one step closer, paused, waited for permission. The mother hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. Jonah crouched, hooked his arms under the male's shoulders, and lifted with practiced care. The Keshari was lighter than he expected, all long bone and hunger. Jonah shifted him onto his back like a fireman carry. The wind bit harder as Jonah stepped out from under the tarp. It tried to steal the heat sheet away. Jonah grabbed the edge and secured it with a clip from his belt, fastening it around the young one and her mother. Then he started walking. The storm made distance into a lie. 100 meters felt like 10 kilometers. Jonah leaned into it, boots biting, the Keshari man's weight pulling him sideways. Behind him, the mother guided the young one with one hand, the other held out for balance. Their footprints filled with drifting ice almost instantly. Jonah didn't head toward any settlement. Not the mining camp ruins, not the corporate outposts that still sent drones through the sky like they owned the air. He headed for a dead place. Everyone on Vesper's Reach knew about Habitat 7. It was an old research dome from the early days, biolab, hydroponics, living quarters. When the mining boom collapsed and the corporations pulled out, Habitat 7 had been decommissioned, which meant they locked the doors and left whatever they couldn't sell. Rumor said it was haunted. Jonah knew better. It was just empty, and emptiness was a luxury. The dome's outline appeared at last as the storm shifted, a dark curve against the white. Half buried, the airlock rimmed with ice. One of the outer panels had buckled years ago and never been repaired. Jonah reached the hatch, set the Keshari man down as gently as he could, and pulled out a multi-tool. The lock was mechanical, a blessing. Jonah's fingers worked fast, muscles remembering old routines. Pop the cover, bypass the tumbler, feed the line through, twist. The hatch resisted for 2 full minutes, then gave with a groan like an animal waking up. Jonah shoved it open. The air inside was stale, cold, and utterly still. No wind, no screaming song, just quiet. The mother stumbled in first, guiding the young one. Jonah dragged the male in behind them, then pulled the hatch shut. The dome's interior lights didn't come on. Of course they didn't. Jonah pulled a small glow stick from his pocket, snapped it, and tossed it to the floor. Green light spilled across dust and old plastic. The dome looked exactly like Jonah remembered. Rows of hydroponic trays long since dried out, a common area with overturned chairs, walls marked by old corporate signage that had faded into ghost gray. But the dome was intact. Intact meant shelter. Shelter meant time. Jonah set the Keshari man down on a bench and peeled back the heat sheet. The man's lips were a deeper blue than the rest of his face. His breathing was shallow, quick. Hypothermia, starvation, maybe infection. Jonah rummaged through a cabinet. Most were empty. One still held medical supplies in sealed packs expired on paper, but Jonah had used worse. He opened a thermal patch, slapped it to the Keshari's chest ridge. He offered water. The mother watched every movement like a hawk. Fear, yes, but also calculation. The kind that came from a life of bargaining for survival. When Jonah offered her a ration brick, she didn't take it at first. She stared at it, then at him, then at her daughter. Then she repeated the gesture again, the offer. This time her hands shook. Jonah exhaled slowly, forcing his anger to stay quiet. Anger wasn't a weapon here, it was a spark in a room full of fumes. No, he said again, softer. He touched his own chest. Jonah. He pointed at her. She hesitated, then touched her chest and spoke a word that the dome's acoustics carried cleanly. Sorry, Jonah nodded. Sorry. He pointed at the young one. The girl stared at his hand like it might bite. Then, reluctantly, she touched her own collarbone. Tala. Tala, Jonah repeated. He smiled, not wide, not toothy, just enough to show he wasn't a predator. He pointed at the male who was half-conscious now. Sari said his name with a kind of grief that made Jonah's throat tighten. Oren, Jonah swallowed. Oren, okay. He tore open a heat pack and tucked it under Oren's neck ridge, then started pulling scavenged blankets and foam mats out of storage. There were still bunks in the back quarters, dusty but usable. He set up a corner like a nest, layers of insulation, heat sheet on top, ration brick broken into pieces. Tala watched, eyes wide. She clutched the thermal sheet like it was the only real thing left in the universe. Sari's gaze stayed locked on Jonah's hands. When Jonah finally sat back on his heels, his breath steaming, Sari spoke again, faster. It wasn't panic. It was explanation, words tumbling out like she was trying to prove something. Jonah's translator blinked, struggled, and finally caught fragments. Debt, law, shelter, right, bond, offer, daughter, honorable. Jonah rubbed his face. It's not a debt, you don't owe me. Sari frowned, not understanding. Jonah took a different approach. He stood, walked to the common area, and found an old wall display. It was cracked but still mounted. Beneath it was a plaque with corporate branding and a faded slogan, Habitat 7, where tomorrow lives. Jonah stared at it for a moment, then grabbed a marker from a desk drawer. Miraculously, it still worked. He crossed out the corporate name and wrote in block letters, Home. Then he drew a crude stick figure of 3 Keshari and 1 human under a dome. He added a line over the dome like a roof. He drew a little storm outside. He turned to Sari and Tala. This, he said, pointing at the word. Home, he tapped his chest. Mine, he pointed at them. Yours. He held up 4 fingers. Then pointed at the dome again. Together, silence. Sari's eyes flicked to the word, then to Jonah, then back. Tala stared at the drawing like it was a magic spell. Sari's mouth moved. No sound came out at first. Then she made a small noise that might have been laughter if laughter could carry grief inside it. Her shoulders sagged like a rope had been cut. She sank to her knees and bowed, not in bargaining now, but in exhaustion. Jonah didn't know what to do with that kind of gratitude. He'd never been good at receiving it. So he did what humans did when they didn't know how to hold a feeling. He got busy. For 2 days, the storm didn't let up. Jonah used Habitat 7's dead systems like an old friend. He found a backup generator that still had fuel in a sealed tank. He jury-rigged the lines, patched cracked tubing with foam, and coaxed the dome's heaters into a low, stubborn hum. The temperature rose from deadly to merely miserable, then to livable. Sari watched him work with a mix of awe and suspicion, as if expecting the kindness to turn sharp at any moment. Tala stayed near the bunks at first, silent and wary. But hunger is a blunt teacher. When Jonah offered food, she ate. When Jonah showed her how to refill the water recycler, she copied his movements carefully like a student afraid of punishment. Oren's fever broke on the 2nd night. When he woke, his eyes snapped to Jonah instantly, pupils narrowing. He tried to sit up, then winced. Sari spoke to him rapidly, hands gesturing. Jonah caught enough from the translator's stutter to understand. Storm, shelter, human, no bargain. Oren's gaze moved to Tala, then to the thermal sheet around her shoulders, then to Jonah. The man's throat ridge flexed, his voice came out rough. Why? Jonah leaned back against a cabinet. He was tired in a deep way, the kind that lived in bone. Because, Jonah said, and he meant it, it's wrong. Oren blinked, translator trying to make sense of it. Sari added something short, sharp. The translator spat out, no one gives without taking. Jonah felt that land like a punch. He stared at the dome's dark corners, at the faded corporate slogan half scratched away, at the empty hydroponic trays that had once promised abundance. Yeah, Jonah said quietly, I've noticed. On the 3rd day, the storm eased enough for Jonah's wrist scanner to pick up movement outside, not wildlife. A sled, multiple heat signatures. Jonah went still. He didn't tell the Keshari at first. He didn't want panic. but he moved fast, checking doors, sealing vents, stacking old crates near the airlock as a barricade. Sari saw the tension and didn't need translation. Her hands went to Tala immediately, pulling her close. Oren pushed himself upright despite the pain. He grabbed a length of metal pipe from the floor. His eyes were sharp now. Jonah held up a hand. "We're not doing this with you fighting. You can barely stand." Oren's ridge flexed. He didn't put the pipe down. The airlock thudded. A voice came through the intercom, crackling, smug, human. "Habitat 7, we know someone's inside. Heat signatures lit up like a candle. Open up and we'll be civil." Jonah's jaw tightened. Out here, civil meant you only lost a few teeth. He glanced at Sari and Tala. Tala's eyes were huge, her breathing shallow. Jonah walked to the inner door, hit the intercom, and kept his voice even. "Dome's condemned," he said. "Move along." A laugh crackled back. "Condemned doesn't mean claimed, Rays. You know how this works. That generator you woke up, that's property. You owe rent." Jonah's blood went cold at the name. They weren't random raiders. They knew him. A pause, then the voice again, a little sweeter. "Or maybe you've got something else worth trading. We saw tracks. Blue skins, right? Refugees pay well." Behind Jonah, Sari made a sound like she'd been stabbed. Oren's grip tightened on the pipe. Jonah stared at the door. The old Jonah, the one who had survived by keeping his head down and his mouth shut, whispered that he could bargain. Give them supplies, give them the generator. Maybe they'd leave the Keshari alone if he paid enough. But Jonah had seen how bargains worked on Vesper's Reach. You paid once, you paid forever. And the Keshari had already tried to pay with a daughter. Jonah wasn't letting that be the currency of this world, not while he still had breath to spend. He clicked off the intercom and turned. Sari was shaking, but her eyes were fierce now. She spoke quickly to Jonah, then pointed to herself, then to Tala, then to Oren, then to the door. The translator coughed out, "We will go. We bring danger. You will die for us." Jonah shook his head. "No." Tala stepped forward suddenly, hands clenched. She said something sharp, surprising Jonah with the force of it. Sari's face crumpled. Jonah's translator struggled, then delivered the gist. "I'm not a payment." Tala's voice cracked on the last word, but she held Jonah's gaze. Jonah felt something in his chest loosen, like a knot he hadn't realized he'd tied. "Good," he said softly, "because nobody here is buying." He moved to the storage room and yanked open a cabinet he'd ignored for years. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was an old flare launcher and a box of charges. Industrial, not military, used to signal drones back in the boom days. It wasn't much, but it was loud. Jonah loaded it, then grabbed a coil of wire and a metal plate. He worked fast, setting up a crude trip alarm at the inner hatch. Oren watched, silent now, something like respect bleeding into his wary expression. Sari held Tala close, whispering in her ear. The airlock thudded again. Metal groaned. They were forcing it. Jonah took position behind the barricade, flare launcher in hand. He didn't want to shoot anyone. He just wanted them to leave. The door buckled inward with a scream of stressed bolts. A human arm shoved through the gap, then a shoulder. A face appeared, scarred, grinning. Raise, the man said. You always were sentimental. Jonah raised the launcher. Last warning. The man's grin widened. You gonna burn me with a flare, cute. Jonah aimed not at the man. At the ceiling above the airlock where old sprinklers and ventilation ducts ran, he fired. The flare screamed up, exploded into a blossom of white-hot light, and ignited the dry dust and polymer residue in the vent lining. Smoke poured down instantly. Alarms that hadn't worked in a decade woke up like angry ghosts. Red lights flashed. A synthesized voice blared, fire suppression active, sealing sections. Panels slammed shut across corridors. The dome segmented itself, isolating the airlock zone. The raiders swore, coughing, suddenly less brave. Jonah stepped back as the inner barrier dropped into place with a heavy clang, locking the raiders in the smoky entry chamber. He hit the intercom again. You want civil, Jonah said. Here it is. You walk back out the way you came. Nobody gets hurt. You don't come back. Through the speaker came hacking coughs and muffled curses. Then the scarred man's voice strained. You can't keep us in here forever. Jonah looked at the panel. The dome system readouts were barely alive, but the seal indicators were green. He could keep them in there long enough for them to get scared, long enough for them to regret testing him. You're right, Jonah said. I can't. He leaned closer to the mic. But I can keep you in there long enough to decide what matters more, your pride or your lungs. Silence. Then finally the sound of retreating footsteps, the hiss of the outer hatch cycling. The airlock sensors pinged. The external door opened. Cold air rushed in, dragging smoke out like a hand pulling a curtain. Jonah waited until the dome system registered 0 heat signatures in the entry chamber. Only then did he exhale. His hands were shaking. Oren lowered the pipe slowly. Sari sagged against the wall, eyes shining with something too big for words. Tala stared at Jonah like she was seeing him for the first time, not as a threat, not as a buyer, but as a person who had chosen something hard for no profit at all. Jonah set the flare launcher down and rubbed his palms on his pants. Well, he said, voice rough, that's going to stink for a week. A small sound escaped Tala. It might have been laughter. It might have been the beginning of it. After that, things changed, not all at once, but like ice turning to water. Slowly, inevitably, with a sound you only noticed when it was already happening. Sari stopped making the offering gesture. Her shoulders didn't curl inward as much. She began to move around the dome as if she belonged there, not as if she was squatting in someone else's life. Oren, once he could stand without swaying, helped Jonah reinforce the airlock, using Keshari knotwork Jonah had never seen, intricate, strong, elegant. Jonah taught Oren how to patch tubing with foam. Oren taught Jonah how to read storm patterns by the taste of the air. Tala surprised Jonah most. She wandered into the hydroponics bay one morning and traced her fingers over the dead trays. Her expression went soft, almost mournful. Then she looked up at Jonah and spoke. The translator, now stable in the calmer air, gave him the words clearly. This place used to make food. Yeah, Jonah said, a long time ago. Tala tilted her head. Can it again? Jonah stared at the trays. In his mind, Habitat 7 was a shelter, a hiding place, a pause between disasters. He had never let himself imagine it as anything more. But Tala's question was a seed, and seeds were dangerous because they implied spring. Jonah walked to the storage closet, dug through crates until his fingers hit a sealed container with a faded label, nutrient packs hydroponics. He pulled it out, laughing breathlessly. Maybe, he said, if we're stubborn enough. Tala's eyes brightened just a little. It was like watching sunrise on a world that forgot how. Weeks passed. The dome became warmer, cleaner. Jonah fixed lights one circuit at a time until the hallways glowed soft instead of eerie. Oren repaired a water line that Jonah had given up on. Sari found old bedding and stitched it into thicker quilts with thread made from stripped insulation. They began to mark time by small victories. A working heater coil, a sealed leak, a pot of algae green sprouts that tasted like bitter hope. The outside world didn't stop being cruel. Raiders still prowled. Corporate drones still buzzed overhead sometimes, indifferent as gnats. But inside Habitat 7 there was a pocket of something else. A refusal. One night, as the storm sang outside again, Jonah found Tala sitting in the common area beneath the faded plaque that now read home. She stared at the stick figure drawing Jonah had made weeks ago. Someone, Tala, he realized, had added details. The dome had little lines suggesting reinforcement. The figures had hands touching. Outside, the storm had been drawn smaller. Jonah sat beside her, careful to give space. Tala didn't flinch anymore. After a while, she spoke quietly. When my mother offered me, she said, words deliberate in the translator, I thought that is what I am, a thing that can be traded. Jonah felt his throat tight. Tala kept going, voice steady now. You said no. You did not take, you did not ask. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the soft dome light. Why do humans do that? Jonah stared at the drawing. He wanted to give a noble answer, something about moral codes and empathy and civilization, but the truth was simpler, messier, more human. Because, he said, sometimes we've been the thing on the other side of the bargain. Tala's eyes narrowed slightly, listening. Jonah exhaled. I've been hungry, he admitted. Cold, scared. I've been treated like I didn't matter, like my choices weren't mine. He tapped the word home with one finger. And I got tired of that being the only kind of world there is. Tala was silent for a long time. Then she nodded slowly, as if filing the idea away where it couldn't be stolen. Sari appeared in the doorway, watching them. Her eyes were softer now, too. She spoke in Keshari, and the translator rendered it as, You gave us a roof. We give you family. Jonah blinked hard. He'd never been good at family either. He'd lost his long before he learned how to keep anyone. But he looked at Sari and at Oren behind her, and at Tala sitting beside him with her shoulders no longer curled like a question mark. He looked at the dome, patched, humming, alive again in small, stubborn ways. Outside, Vesper's Reach still sang its cold song. Inside, something else answered. Not louder, just steadier. Jonah nodded once. Yeah, he said, voice rough with something that wasn't the cold. "I think that's a fair trade." Sari's mouth curved in the Keshari version of a smile, subtle but real. Tala added one more line to the drawing with the marker, a tiny circle above the dome, like a pale sun. Jonah watched it appear and realized, with a kind of startled awe, that he had built a home on a dead moon not by conquering it, but by refusing to let desperation decide what people were worth. And out on the ice, where bargains usually ended in blood, that refusal was the most human thing of all.